Two of Hollywood's biggest titans standing face to face at an industry party. The tension is electric. Everyone in the room can feel it. One is the coolest crooner America has ever known, a man who could make grown women faint with just a wink. The other is the most revolutionary actor of his generation, a brooding rebel who changed cinema forever. Their eyes lock. Words are exchanged. And then, without warning, a fist flies through the air. Marlon Brando just punched Frank Sinatra. But here's the thing that nobody saw coming. It's not the punch that left everyone speechless. It's what happened next. Frank Sinatra's reaction was so unexpected, so completely out of character for a man known for his explosive temper, that it became one of Hollywood's most whispered about moments. What could possibly make Old Blue Eyes back down? What happened in that split second that changed everything between these two legends? Before we get to that jaw-dropping moment, you need to understand the powder keg of rivalry, jealousy, and wounded pride that brought us here. The story doesn't begin at that party. No, this tale of two titanic egos starts years earlier on a soundstage in Hollywood, where tensions were already simmering like a pot about to boil over. It was 1955, and the film was Guys and Dolls, a musical comedy that should have been a light-hearted romp through the world of Broadway gamblers and their romantic misadventures. Instead, it became a battleground where two completely opposite philosophies of acting, two completely different personalities, and two massively inflated egos collided with the force of a freight train. Frank Sinatra walked onto that set already nursing a grudge that had been eating at him for over a year. See, in 1954, Marlon Brando had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his unforgettable performance in On the Waterfront. That role, that Oscar, that career-defining moment, it was supposed to be Frank's. Director Elia Kazan had originally promised the role to Sinatra, and Frank had been counting on it to solidify his comeback after winning Best Supporting Actor for From Here to Eternity in 1953. But at the last minute, Kazan changed his mind and gave the role to Brando instead. Frank felt betrayed, humiliated, robbed of what should have been his crowning achievement. So when they were cast together in Guys and Dolls, with Brando getting the lead role of Sky Masterson, the role that Frank believed he was born to play, it wasn't just professional disappointment. It was personal. Frank Sinatra didn't just want to act alongside Marlon Brando. He wanted to show him up, to prove that this mumbling, method-acting pretender didn't belong in his world. From the very first day of filming, you could cut the tension with a knife. Sinatra would show up on set, lines memorized, ready to nail his scenes in 1 or 2 takes. That was his style, instinctive, spontaneous, capturing lightning in a bottle. He'd famously say, "Once is for me, twice is for the other guy, and 3 times is for everybody else." But Brando? Brando would arrive with his lines not quite memorized, wanting to explore the scene, to feel his way through it, to do take after take after take until he found something that felt real to him. This was the essence of method acting, the technique he'd learned from the legendary Stella Adler. These two approaches couldn't have been more different, and the clash was inevitable. The most famous incident from that shoot has become the stuff of Hollywood legend. There was a scene where Sinatra's character, Nathan Detroit, had to eat slice after slice of cheesecake while talking to Brando's Sky Masterson. Now, Sinatra hated doing multiple takes. Hated it with a passion that burned hotter than 1,000 suns. And Brando knew it. So what did Brando do? Take after take, he would deliberately flub his lines. Just a little mistake here, a tiny forgotten word there. Nothing too obvious, but enough to force another take. And another. And another. Poor Frank had to keep eating that cheesecake, slice after slice, take after take, his face getting redder, his jaw clenching tighter, while Brando stood there with that inscrutable expression, apologizing oh so sincerely for his mistakes. Was it accidental? Was Brando really struggling with his lines? Or was this the most passive-aggressive revenge ever executed on a Hollywood soundstage? Those who were there that day will tell you. Marlon Brando knew exactly what he was doing. But the psychological warfare didn't stop there. Sinatra started calling Brando Mumbles on set, a derisive nickname that mocked Brando's quiet, naturalistic way of speaking. It wasn't just teasing. It was meant to sting, to undermine, to get under Brando's skin. And in retaliation, Brando would slow down even more, become even more methodical, drawing out scenes until Sinatra was practically vibrating with frustration. The director, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, found himself playing referee between 2 heavyweight champions who refused to be in the same room together unless the cameras were rolling. They stopped speaking to each other directly. Messages had to be passed through intermediaries. If Sinatra needed to communicate something to Brando, he'd tell the assistant director, who would then relay it to Marlon. It was absurd, childish, and absolutely real. But here's what you need to understand. This wasn't just about two actors having different approaches to their craft. This feud went deeper, cutting into the very souls of who these men were and what they represented. Marlon Brando. To understand why that punch happened, you need to understand Marlon Brando. And trust me, there has never been anyone quite like him in the history of cinema. Born on April 3, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska, Marlon Brando Jr. came into this world screaming, and he never really stopped challenging everything around him. His childhood was a battlefield of dysfunction that would shape the man and the artist he would become. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., was a traveling salesman who sold calcium carbonate and everything else he could get his hands on. But what he was really good at selling was criticism, disappointment, and fear. He was a hard-drinking, womanizing bully who seemed to take pleasure in tearing down his sensitive, artistic son. Nothing young Marlon did was ever good enough for his father. The boy was called weak, stupid, a failure before he'd even had a chance to succeed at anything. His mother, Dorothy Julia, known as Dodie, was an actress herself, a woman of considerable talent who had dreams of her own before marriage and motherhood trapped her in a life she never wanted. She escaped through alcohol, drinking herself into oblivion most days, leaving young Marlon to essentially raise himself. He would come home from school to find her passed out, bottles scattered around the house. He'd clean up, try to take care of her, and wonder why he wasn't enough to make her want to stay sober. This abandonment, this feeling of never being truly seen or valued by the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally, would haunt Brando for the rest of his life. It would inform every role he played, every relationship he entered, every self-destructive choice he made. But it would also give him access to a well of pain and vulnerability that he could tap into on screen, bringing an emotional authenticity that audiences had never seen before. Young Marlon was a wild child, getting expelled from high school for riding a motorcycle through the hallways. His father, in a rare moment of attempted parenting, sent him to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota, hoping that discipline and structure would straighten him out. It didn't work. Marlon hated the rigid rules, the mindless obedience, the whole authoritarian culture of military school. He rebelled at every opportunity, ultimately getting himself expelled from there too. For a while, he drifted, working manual labor jobs, digging ditches, and wondering if his father was right. Maybe he was just a worthless screw-up destined for nothing. Then, almost by accident, he found his calling. His sister Jocelyn was studying acting in New York with Stella Adler, one of the great teachers of the Stanislavski method. She suggested that Marlon give it a try. He was 20 years old and had no particular interest in acting, but he had no other prospects either. So he figured, why not? Stella Adler changed his life. She saw something in this rough, wounded young man that nobody else had seen. A raw talent so pure, so powerful that it took her breath away. She taught him that acting wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about finding the truth of the character within yourself, accessing your own pain, your own joy, your own humanity, and channeling it through the role. She taught him to use his imagination, to create a complete inner life for every character he played. She taught him that even when playing a villain or a brute, you had to find the vulnerability, because every human being is vulnerable underneath their armor. And Brando, who had spent his entire childhood feeling vulnerable and trying to hide it, understood this instinctively. He took to method acting like a fish to water, and Stella knew she had discovered something special. His breakthrough came in 1947 when he was cast as Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams' play, A Streetcar Named Desire, on Broadway. He was only 23 years old, but his performance was a revolution. Stanley was brutal, animalistic, violent, and yet somehow still human. Still someone you could understand even if you couldn't condone his actions. Brando didn't play Stanley as a one-dimensional villain. He played him as a wounded animal, a man who felt threatened by Blanche's refinement and education, a man who lashed out because he didn't have the words to express his feelings any other way. When he screamed Stella into the night, it wasn't just a man calling for his wife. It was a primal howl of need, of desire, of everything that makes us human and animal at the same time. Audiences had never seen anything like it. The theater world was stunned. Then came the movies. In 1951, he reprised his role as Stanley in the film version of A Streetcar Named Desire, bringing his revolutionary style of acting to cinema for the first time. Watching that performance today, you can still feel the seismic shift it represents. Everything before Brando suddenly looked old-fashioned, theatrical, artificial. His naturalistic style, his mumbling, his body language, the way he could convey volumes without saying a word, it all felt shockingly real. He wasn't performing. He was being. In 1952, he starred in Viva Zapata as the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, bringing depth and humanity to a historical figure. In 1953, he played Mark Antony in Julius Caesar, proving he could handle classical material with the same intensity he brought to modern roles. But it was On the Waterfront, in 1954, that cemented his place in cinema history. His portrayal of Terry Malloy, the washed-up boxer who finds his conscience and his courage, is still considered one of the greatest performances ever captured on film. That famous scene in the taxicab with Rod Steiger, where Terry confronts his brother Charlie about throwing away his boxing career. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody instead of a bum, which is what I am. Isn't just great acting. It's a moment of truth so raw, so painful, that it transcends acting and becomes something else entirely. Brando wasn't just playing Terry Malloy. He was channeling every moment of his own life when he felt he'd been let down, when he felt he could have been more if only someone had believed in him. That Oscar he won for On the Waterfront wasn't just an award. It was validation from an industry and an audience that recognized they were watching greatness. And then came The Godfather in 1972, where he completely transformed himself into Don Vito Corleone, stuffing his cheeks with cotton, adopting a raspy whisper, creating an iconic character that would define organized crime in cinema forever. That was the genius of Marlon Brando. He didn't just play characters. He inhabited them so completely that you forgot you were watching an actor at all. But Brando's personal life was as chaotic and troubled as many of the characters he played. He was married 3 times, to Anna Koshfi in 1957, Movita Castaneda in 1960, and Tarita Tarapea in 1962. But marriage and monogamy were never Brando's strong suits. He had numerous affairs, countless relationships, and fathered at least 11 children, though some speculate the number might be higher. He loved his children, but like his own father, he struggled to show it in healthy ways. Tragedy stalked his family. His son Christian was convicted of manslaughter in 1990 for killing his half-sister Cheyenne's boyfriend. Cheyenne herself, suffering from mental illness and the trauma of that event, took her own life in 1995. Brando was devastated, retreating further into isolation and despair. As he aged, Brando became increasingly reclusive and eccentric. He gained massive amounts of weight, ballooning to over 300 pounds. He refused most acting roles, and when he did accept them, he often didn't bother to learn his lines, instead having them fed to him through an earpiece or written on cue cards. He bought an entire island in Tahiti just to get away from the world. He became fascinated with Native American rights, famously refusing his Oscar for The Godfather in 1973 and sending activist Sachin Littlefeather to the ceremony to deliver a speech about Hollywood's mistreatment of indigenous peoples. Some called it principled. Others called it grandstanding. That was Brando, always controversial, always unpredictable, always refusing to be what anyone expected him to be. When he died on July 1, 2004, at the age of 80, the world mourned the loss of perhaps the greatest actor who ever lived. But the man who died was a far cry from the young, beautiful, dangerous creature who had revolutionized cinema 50 years earlier. Frank Sinatra. Now let's talk about the other man in this story, because if Marlon Brando was the revolutionary who changed acting forever, Frank Sinatra was the ultimate embodiment of cool, the chairman of the board, the voice, a man whose legend was built not just on talent, but on sheer force of personality. Francis Albert Sinatra was born on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, the only child of Italian immigrants. His birth was so difficult that the doctor didn't think he would survive. The forceps used to extract him damaged his ear and left a scar on his face that would remain for life. His mother, Dolly, was a fierce, domineering woman who basically ran the neighborhood through a combination of political connections and sheer willpower. She was a midwife, an abortionist when abortion was illegal, and a fixer who could get things done through her connections to the local political machine. Young Frank learned from her that relationships were currency, that loyalty was everything, and that you never, ever showed weakness. His father, Marty, was a boxer who became a fireman, a quiet man completely overshadowed by his formidable wife. Frank was spoiled as a child, given anything he wanted, dressed in expensive clothes even though the family wasn't wealthy. Dolly wanted her son to be somebody, to rise above their working-class immigrant roots, and she instilled in him both towering ambition and crippling insecurity. He had to be the best. Anything less than the best was failure. And failure was not acceptable. Frank discovered singing as a teenager, idolizing Bing Crosby and dreaming of making it big. Unlike Brando, who stumbled into acting almost by accident, Sinatra knew exactly what he wanted from the moment he heard Crosby's voice on the radio. He wanted to make people feel something with his voice. He wanted to be loved, adored, worshipped by millions. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get there. His break came in 1939 when he joined Harry James' band as a vocalist. The following year, he moved to Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, where he truly learned his craft. Dorsey taught him breath control, phrasing, how to sustain a note until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath with you. But Sinatra's ambition was too big to be contained in someone else's band. In 1942, he went solo, and within a year, he was the biggest star in America. His concert at the Paramount Theater in New York in 1944 caused a literal riot. Thousands of teenage girls called Bobby Soxers mobbed the venue, screaming, crying, fainting at the sound of his voice. It was the first example of modern fan hysteria, a precursor to what would later happen with Elvis and the Beatles. Frank Sinatra had become a phenomenon, but his success in the late 40s started to crumble. His voice, strained from overwork and damaged by vocal hemorrhaging, began to fail him. His film career stalled. His marriage to Nancy Barbato, his childhood sweetheart who had stood by him through the lean years, fell apart because of his very public affair with movie star Ava Gardner. The press turned on him. His record sales dropped. Club owners who had once begged him to perform were now hesitant to book him. By 1952, Frank Sinatra was yesterday's news, a has-been at 36 years old. It would have destroyed a lesser man. But Sinatra refused to go down without a fight. He begged, pleaded, and practically demanded the role of Private Angelo Maggio in From Here to Eternity. Even though the studio didn't want him, he agreed to do it for only $8,000, a fraction of what he'd earned at his peak. And it saved his career. His performance was raw, vulnerable, and completely genuine. Playing a scrappy little soldier who gets beaten to death for refusing to back down, Sinatra channeled all his own pain, his own fear that he might really be finished, and it showed on screen. When he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1954, it wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection. Suddenly Frank was hot again. Capitol Records signed him, and he began recording some of the greatest albums in pop music history. In the Wee Small Hours, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Come Fly With Me, Only the Lonely. His voice had matured, deepened, gained a richness and emotional depth that his younger self could never have achieved. He wasn't just a singer anymore. He was an interpreter of the American songbook, taking classic tunes and making them completely his own. He phrased like a jazz musician, bending notes and rhythms to suit his emotional intentions. He could break your heart with a ballad and make you want to dance with an uptempo swinger. Frank Sinatra in the 50s and 60s wasn't just an entertainer. He was an American institution. Then came the Rat Pack: Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. They ruled Las Vegas, making movies by day and performing at the Sands Hotel by night, drinking, smoking, and projecting an image of masculine cool that defined an era. They were kings of the world, and Frank was the undisputed leader. But that power came with darkness. Sinatra's temper was legendary. He could turn on a dime, going from charming and generous to violent and vindictive in seconds. He had fistfights with journalists who wrote things he didn't like. He threatened people. His connections to organized crime figures were an open secret. He cultivated friendships with mobsters like Sam Giancana and had been photographed with them numerous times. Was he on the mob payroll? Was his career helped along by mafia muscle? The rumors persisted throughout his life, and while nothing was ever proven, the shadow was always there. His romantic life was a revolving door of beautiful women. After his marriage to Ava Gardner imploded in spectacular fashion, they were too much alike, both tempestuous, jealous, and unfaithful. He married Mia Farrow in 1966 when he was 50 and she was 21. That marriage lasted less than 2 years. Then came Barbara Marx in 1976, his fourth and final wife, who stuck with him until the end. Frank loved women, But he also needed to control them, to be the center of attention, to be adored and obeyed. His relationships were passionate, volatile, and often short-lived. He was generous to a fault with his friends, giving lavish gifts, helping people out financially, showing fierce loyalty to those in his inner circle. But cross him, betray him, or show him disrespect, and you were cut off forever. He famously ended his friendship with Peter Lawford after the Kennedys snubbed him, blaming Lawford for not intervening on his behalf. Sinatra could hold a grudge longer than anyone, nursing it, feeding it, letting it grow into something monstrous. By the time Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82, he had recorded nearly 1,300 songs, won 11 Grammy Awards, including the Grammy Legend Award and the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and an Academy Award. He'd sold over 150 million records worldwide. He'd starred in over 60 films. He was, without question, one of the most important cultural figures of the 20th century. But he was also a complicated man, generous and cruel, charming and terrifying, talented beyond measure and deeply flawed. He was, in many ways, as complex and contradictory as the country he represented.